The day Lena Hartwell got screamed at in the middle of the hospital cafeteria, she was wearing scrubs that hadn't been washed in 36 hours and carrying a cup of coffee she hadn't had a single sip of yet. She'd been on her feet since 5 in the morning. Not 5 in the morning of that day, 5 in the morning of the day before. A double shift that bled into another double shift because 2 nurses called out sick and someone had to cover the ICU, and Lena was the someone who always said yes when everyone else said no. That was just the kind of person she was. Her supervisor, Patrice, used to joke about it. Hartwell doesn't have a no in her vocabulary. Lena used to laugh at that. That Tuesday in March, standing at the register in the hospital cafeteria with a tray of scrambled eggs and burnt coffee, she wasn't laughing. The cafeteria at Mercy General in Columbus, Ohio, was the kind of place that smelled like industrial cleaner no matter what time of day you walked in. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. There were maybe 15 people scattered around the room. A few orderlies at a corner table, a couple of administrative staff near the windows, 2 med students hunched over laptops. Lena had found an empty table near the back and was just setting her tray down when she heard his voice, "Excuse me, excuse me." She turned. The man standing 3 feet away from her was somewhere in his early 50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His name was Bernard Thatch. She would learn that later. In that moment, she just saw a man with ruddy cheeks and small, impatient eyes staring at her like she had personally offended him by existing in his line of sight. "You're a nurse here?" he said. It wasn't really a question. Lena looked down at her scrubs, the hospital ID clipped to her chest, the stethoscope around her neck. "Yes, then maybe you can explain to me," he said, his voice rising, "why my mother has been sitting in a room on the 4th floor for 3 hours without anyone checking on her. 3 hours. I called the desk twice. Nobody picked up." Lena felt the exhaustion behind her eyes sharpen into something more alert. She understood the frustration. She did. Families waiting on news were some of the most anxious people in the world, and that anxiety didn't always come out looking like patience. "Sir, I'm sorry your mother's been waiting. I work in the ICU. I'm not on the 4th floor team, but if you want, I can walk you to the nurse's station up there, and we can find someone who—" "I don't need you to walk me anywhere," he said. "I need someone to do their job." The room had gotten quieter. Lena noticed it the way you notice a change in the weather, gradually, then all at once. "I understand you're frustrated," she said carefully. "Don't tell me you understand. You don't understand anything." His voice had climbed another register. "You people sit around drinking your coffee and eating your little breakfasts while patients are left alone in rooms. My mother is 82 years old. She's frightened. She doesn't know where she is, and not one single person on that floor has bothered to check on her in 3 hours." "I hear you," Lena said, "and I promise you, the nurses on that floor are not ignoring your mother. They are managing. Don't make excuses for them." He stepped closer. Not close enough to be physically threatening, but close enough to make the air feel different. "This is exactly what's wrong with healthcare in this country. You're all completely useless. Every single one of you." Lena set her coffee down very carefully on the table. 36 hours without sleep. A patient she'd lost at 2 a.m. A 44-year-old man named Gerald who'd come in with chest pain and never went home. She'd been the one who updated his wife. She'd been the one who stood in that hallway and watched a woman's world collapse. And then she'd gone back to the ICU and kept working, because there were 6 other patients who needed her. She did not say any of that. "Sir," she said, and her voice was quiet and very steady. "I'm going to finish my breakfast, and then I'm going to go back upstairs and take care of my patients. If you'd like help finding someone on the 4th floor, I'm happy to assist. But I won't stand here and be spoken to this way." Bernard Thatch stared at her for a moment, then he laughed. Not a kind laugh. "Of course," he said. "Of course you won't. Heaven forbid someone holds you people accountable." He turned to the room, actually turned, like he was addressing an audience. "This is a nurse at Mercy General, everyone. This is who's taking care of your family members." The silence in the room was absolute. Lena felt something hot and terrible move through her chest. Not anger exactly, more like grief. The particular grief of being reduced to nothing in front of people who said nothing, who looked away, who suddenly became very interested in their food. She picked up her tray. She walked to the nearest trash can and threw away the scrambled eggs and the coffee she'd never gotten to drink. And then she walked out of the cafeteria, straight to the elevator, and rode it back up to the ICU. She did not cry until she got to the supply closet on the third floor, and even then, she only let herself have 2 minutes. What Bernard Thatch did not know, what no one in that cafeteria that morning knew, was that Lena Hartwell had not always been just a nurse. That was a strange thing to say, and she would have hated hearing it put that way. She was proud of being a nurse. It was the thing she'd worked hardest for in her life, the thing she'd chosen deliberately and completely. But there was a chapter of her life that came before the scrubs and the stethoscope, and it wasn't a quiet chapter. Lena had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, the youngest of 4 children, in a house that was loud and warm and occasionally chaotic. Her father, Robert Hartwell, had served 22 years in the Navy. Her oldest brother, Thomas, had followed him in. Her second brother, Patrick, had gone Army. Only her sister Claire and Lena herself had gone different directions. Claire to law school, Lena to nursing. But Lena had also spent 3 years, between college and nursing school, working as a combat medic with the Army Reserve. She'd deployed twice. She'd seen things that showed up in her dreams sometimes, still even now. She'd learned to keep her hands steady when everything around her was falling apart. She'd learned that fear was just adrenaline that hadn't been given a job yet. None of that was visible when she was standing in the cafeteria in her scrubs. That was fine. She didn't need it to be visible. She knew who she was. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing on that Tuesday morning in March, was that someone else in that cafeteria had known exactly who she was, too. His name was Corporal James Rourke, though he'd been out of the service for 4 years and nobody called him Corporal anymore. He was 31 years old, and he'd come to Mercy General that morning, not as a patient but as a visitor. His sister had just had a baby, her first, and he'd driven 2 hours from Cincinnati to see her. He'd stopped in the cafeteria to get coffee before heading upstairs, and he'd been standing at the condiment station, fixing his cup, when he heard the commotion behind him. He'd watched the whole thing. The man in the suit, the nurse who kept her voice steady even when the man's voice wasn't. The way the room looked away, the way she walked to the trash can and threw away her food and left without saying another word. Rourke had been in enough situations to recognize composure when he saw it. That wasn't someone swallowing weakness. That was someone choosing not to spend their strength on a target that wasn't worth it. He picked up his coffee and thought about it. He'd seen her ID badge from where he was standing. Hartwell, ICU. He'd seen the way she moved, efficient, calibrated, the walk of someone who'd spent a long time operating in high-pressure environments. He'd also noticed something else, a tattoo on her left forearm, partially visible beneath her scrub sleeve. A small compass rose, military ink. He'd seen enough of it to recognize it. He didn't follow her out of the cafeteria. That wasn't the right move. Instead, he took out his phone and texted his sister, "Gonna be a few more minutes." And then he sat down at a table and thought about what, if anything, he was going to do. What he did was talk to the hospital chaplain. This required some explanation. Father Dominic Ossie, a gentle, rotund man in his 60s who had worked at Mercy General for 20 years and knew roughly every person who worked within its walls, was the one who told Rourke who Lena Hartwell was. Not her medical record, not her personal history, just the basics. She was one of the best ICU nurses on staff. She'd been there for 6 years. She was the person other nurses called when things got really bad because she didn't panic and she didn't fold. Father Dominic had seen her sit with dying patients at 3 in the morning when there was no family to call. He'd seen her pray with people she didn't share a religion with because it was what they needed. He'd seen her lose patience and go right back to work because there was no other option. "She had a rough morning," Rourke said. Father Dominic nodded slowly. "She has rough mornings sometimes? She handles them. There was a man in the cafeteria. He was." Rourke paused, looking for the right word. "I've heard," Father Dominic said, which told Rourke that the hospital grapevine was faster than he'd expected. "Does anyone know who he is?" "Bernard Thatch," the chaplain said. "His mother is on the 4th floor. He's a property developer. He's been here before." "He is." Father Dominic chose his words carefully. "A man who is accustomed to getting what he wants very quickly." Rourke nodded. He asked one more question before he stood up to leave. "The tattoo on her arm. Compass rose." Father Dominic looked at him for a moment. "She deployed twice," he said. "Combat medic. I believe she received a commendation. She doesn't talk about it." Rourke put his coffee cup down. "Thank you, Father." He didn't do anything that day. He went upstairs, held his nephew for the first time, watched his sister fall asleep with a smile still on her face, and drove back to Cincinnati. But he didn't stop thinking about it. He had a friend. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was currently a master sergeant in the Army Reserve, stationed out of Columbus. More relevantly, Marcus Webb ran a nonprofit on the side, a small operation that organized community events recognizing first responders and veterans. Nothing flashy, local stuff, recognition dinners, school visits, that kind of thing. Rourke called him on the drive home. "I need a favor," he said. Marcus said, "What kind?" "The kind where someone gets seen." It took 3 weeks to put together. Rourke learned later that it almost didn't happen at all. There were scheduling conflicts, a venue problem, a question about whether the hospital administration would get involved in a way that made things awkward. But Marcus was good at solving problems, and he solved those ones. The event was framed as a first responder appreciation evening, co-hosted by the nonprofit and a local veterans organization. It was held at a community center in Westside Columbus on a Thursday evening in April. About 120 people attended: veterans, active duty personnel, hospital staff, local press, a few city council members. Lena did not know she was being honored until 48 hours before the event. She found out because her supervisor Patrice came to find her during a shift, which was unusual enough that Lena felt a spike of alarm before Patrice even opened her mouth. Patrice said, "There's an event on Thursday. They want to recognize you. We'd like you to go." Lena said, "Recognize me for what?" Patrice said, "Your service, both kinds." Lena stared at her. She thought about the cafeteria. She thought about the cold coffee and the scrambled eggs in the trash can. She thought about 2 minutes in a supply closet on the 3rd floor. "I don't need to be," she started. "Lena," Patrice said, "go." She wore her dress uniform. She hadn't put it on in 2 years, and she spent 20 minutes the night before making sure everything was right. The ribbons in the correct order, the fabric pressed, the buttons aligned. It felt strange and familiar at the same time, like speaking a language she hadn't used in a while and finding it still lived in her hands. Her dog came with her. His name was Boone, and he was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois she'd adopted from a military working dog retirement program 2 years earlier. He was black and tan, 72 pounds, and he had the particular quality of stillness that working dogs have, not passive, not relaxed, but calibrated, ready. He sat in the passenger seat of her car on the drive over and watched the road like he was navigating. She'd trained with working dogs during her time with the reserve. Boone wasn't her service dog in the formal sense. She didn't have a diagnosis that qualified for one, but he'd become something close to it. He knew when her hand started shaking. He knew when she needed him to sit next to her and just be 65 pounds of warm, steady weight. She'd stopped trying to explain it to people. They arrived at the community center at 6:15. The parking lot was fuller than she'd expected. She sat in her car for a moment, looking at the building, and Boone pushed his nose into her shoulder. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She didn't know most of the people inside. She was introduced to Marcus Webb first, a compact, serious-faced man who shook her hand and said he was glad she came. She was introduced to the mayor's deputy, a city council member she vaguely recognized from the news, and 2 representatives from the veterans organization. And then she was introduced to James Rourke. He was taller than she'd expected. Somehow, she realized she'd constructed an image of him without ever having actually seen his face clearly in the cafeteria. He had dark eyes and a calm way of holding himself that she recognized without being able to name it immediately. "Corporal Rourke," Marcus said. "Just James," Rourke said, and shook her hand. "I'm glad you came." Lena looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, quiet and mutual, the way it sometimes happened between people who'd been in similar places without ever being in the same one. "You were in the cafeteria," she said. "Not a question." "I was," he said. She nodded slowly. "You didn't have to do this." "No," he agreed. "But someone should have." The program was not long. There were a few short speeches. Marcus spoke about the work of the nonprofit. One of the council members said something about community. The director of Mercy General's nursing program said something about the nature of service. Lena sat in the front row and kept her hands in her lap and her face neutral. Then Marcus called her name. She stood up and walked to the small podium at the front of the room, and the 120 people in the folding chairs stood up too. and the sound they made was not polite applause. It was the kind that doesn't have a ceiling, that fills a room past its capacity, that makes the fluorescent lights feel warmer than they are. Boone sat at her left heel and looked out at the crowd. Marcus read from a prepared statement. Her 2 deployments, her commendation, her 6 years in the ICU, the specific instances he'd been able to document where her actions had made a measurable difference. A patient who'd coded and come back because of her response time. A family who'd written a letter to the hospital board, a newer nurse she'd mentored who was now heading an ICU team in Pittsburgh. She hadn't known about the letter. She hadn't known about the Pittsburgh nurse, that Danny had taken a leadership role. She felt something loosen in her chest. When the applause finally settled, she stood at the podium for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "I didn't do anything special. I just showed up." She paused. "That's the whole job. You show up. You stay. You do the work in front of you, even when it's hard, even when you're tired, even when the person across from you doesn't see you as a person at all. You do it anyway, because the work isn't about being seen. It's about being there." She looked out at the room. "But I'll tell you something," she said, and her voice changed slightly, not louder, just more direct. "It matters. When someone sees you, it matters more than you think it does. So if you know someone who's just showing up and doing the work and not asking for anything in return, tell them. Tell them you see them. Don't wait until they're standing in a cafeteria wondering if any of it is worth it." The room was very quiet. Then someone in the back started clapping again, and the rest of the room followed, and Boone lifted his head briefly and then settled it back against her ankle. She found out about Bernard Thatch 3 days later, and not because she went looking. She was at the nurse's station on the ICU floor when Patrice came to find her again, 2 visits in a month, which was more than Patrice had ever done in 6 years, and this time Patrice was holding a printout. "You should know," Patrice said, "that the hospital received a formal inquiry last week." Lena looked at her. "From the state medical board," Patrice said, "about the pattern of complaints filed by one Bernard Thatch against Mercy General staff over the past 3 years. She set the printout on the desk. He's filed 14 complaints in 3 years, against 12 different staff members, all in moments of distress around his mother's care. None of the complaints have resulted in disciplinary action, because none of them were substantiated." Lena looked at the printout. Why is the medical board looking at it now? Patrice's expression was carefully neutral. "Apparently someone filed a counter-report," she said, "documenting the pattern. The inquiry is not about the staff. It's about him." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Do we know who filed it?" Patrice said. "The report came from a legal clinic that works with veterans advocacy groups. That's all I know." Lena thought about James Rourke, about Marcus Webb, about Father Dominic's measured, careful way of saying things without saying them. She thought about a man in an expensive suit who had stood in a cafeteria and turned to face a room of people like they were his jury, like she was a prop in an argument he was making about a world that had disappointed him. She thought about 14 complaints in 3 years. She thought about the supply closet on the 3rd floor and the 2 minutes and the cold coffee in the trash. She did not feel triumph. That surprised her a little. What she felt was something quieter, a kind of settling, like a picture that had been slightly crooked for a long time finally finding level. Bernard Thatch's mother was discharged from Mercy General 10 days after the inquiry was filed. She went to a rehabilitation center on the east side of Columbus, and the last thing she said to the 4th floor nursing staff before she left was, "You've all been so kind to me." Her name was Dorothy. She was 82 years old, and she had a photograph of her late husband on her bedside table, and she had asked one of the nurses to read to her every evening because her eyes weren't good anymore. She had nothing to do with what her son had done. Lena thought about that a lot in the days that followed. She thought about Dorothy Thatch sitting in a room on the 4th floor, frightened and disoriented, not knowing where her son was or why no one had come yet. The anxiety underneath his cruelty. The love underneath the anxiety. Maybe. Or at least something that had started as love and calcified into something harder over decades of feeling like the world moved too slowly and owed him too much. She didn't excuse him. She just tried to understand the shape of it, the way you try to understand the shape of a difficult shift, not so you can fix it, so you can carry it without it breaking you. In May, Lena was asked to speak at a career day at a middle school in Whitehall. She almost said no. She wasn't a speaker. She wasn't someone who did career days. Then she thought about what she'd said at the podium. Tell them you see them. She went. She wore her scrubs. She brought Boone. 32 12-year-olds in a gymnasium who were supposed to be learning about career paths spent most of their time staring at Boone, which was fine. She talked about what nurses actually do. Not the TV version, not the glamorous version, but the real version. She talked about double shifts and the smell of industrial cleaner, and the moment you realize you've been awake for so long that the edges of everything get a little soft. She talked about what it means to sit with someone in the worst moment of their life and just refuse to leave. A girl in the second row, serious-faced, with her hair in a tight bun, the kind of kid who takes notes even at career day, raised her hand and asked, "Does it ever feel like it's not worth it?" Lena thought about the cafeteria. She thought about Rourke at the podium. She thought about Danny in Pittsburgh, leading an ICU team she didn't know was hers yet. "Yes," she said honestly. "Sometimes it does." The girl nodded like this was the answer she'd expected and respected. But then something happens. Lena said, "And you remember that it was never about the feeling. It was about the choice. You can choose to keep showing up even when it doesn't feel worth it. And eventually, not always, but eventually, the feeling catches up with the choice." The girl wrote something in her notebook. Lena drove home with Boone's head in her lap and the windows down and the particular lightness of a day that had been, against all expectations, exactly what it was supposed to be. She ran into James Rourke one more time that spring at a coffee shop in Clintonville on a Saturday morning. He was at a corner table with a book and a large cup of something that steamed. She was in line, off-duty, in jeans and a flannel shirt, Boone on a leash at her side. He looked up and saw her, and she saw him see her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he raised his coffee cup slightly in a kind of acknowledgement, and she nodded, and she ordered her coffee and went and sat down 2 tables away. After a few minutes, she said, without looking up from her phone, "Thank you for whatever you did." He said, also without looking up from his book, "I didn't do much. You saw something," she said, "and you did something about it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You would have been fine without it." "Probably," she said, "but it was still the right thing to do." Boone wandered over to Rourke's table, sniffed his hand, and then lay down at his feet. Rourke looked down at him, then back at his book. "Good dog," he said. Lena looked up. "He's a very good judge of character." Rourke smiled at his book. Lena sipped her coffee. Outside, Columbus was doing what it did in late May. Cautiously, hopefully warm, the trees making their case for a summer that was finally, genuinely arriving. People walked past the windows with the slightly dazed expressions of a city that had survived another winter and wasn't quite ready to believe it was over. Lena Hartwell sat with her coffee and her dog, and the particular kind of quiet that comes not from the absence of noise but from the presence of enough. She had a shift in 12 hours. She would go in. She would stay. She would do the work. And if anyone asked her later what had changed between that morning in the cafeteria and this morning in the coffee shop, she wouldn't have been able to give a simple answer. Nothing had changed, really. She was still the same person. She still wore the same scrubs. She still lost patience sometimes and had to walk back to the unit anyway. But something had been named. Something that had been invisible had been made visible, not loudly, not with fanfare, just with the quiet insistence of someone who had stood in a cafeteria and thought that's not right. And then done something about it. That was enough. It turned out that was actually enough.